Okay, welcome. Thanks for being here. It's good to see you, and appreciate you taking time on a Saturday morning to get here eventually. Yeah. And again, thanks to Return Home, to my good friend Katie, and to Micah, who's the CEO, boss, CEO. Okay. So we're gonna walk through 4 segments today. We're going to show you the components of a thesis project and the focus of a thesis project. We'll talk a little bit about the difference between traditional funerals and contemporary events. I don't want to say contemporary funerals because there's more than just funerals that are happening. We'll take a short break. We'll come back for section 2. We're going to give you a summary. Let me show you what the dissertation, the thesis project looks like. This is the end result. Okay, so 425 pages or so. We're going to summarize this. And then we're going to talk about the 4 tasks of mourning and 5 death rituals, which is really at the heart of my research. Take another little break, segment 3. We're going to summarize chapters 4 and 5 of the thesis project. I want to show you the results of my research. Little break. And then we're going to look at the final chapter, which is the summary of all the work that I have done. A couple more questions if you have them. And then Micah and Katie can give you a tour of the facilities here if you'd like to do that, okay? How are we doing? Good. All right, let's get into this. A thesis project, as Leroy had kind of introduced us to just a few moments ago, consists of 3 major components. First of all, a scholarly paper. I just showed you what that looks like. And a bunch of that document that I wrote has to do with the research that I conducted, not only reading, but also training, surveying, measuring, training results, and so forth. And then today, professional presentation. I was scheduled to do this 5 months ago, but the day before the presentation, I was involved in an auto accident and had to cancel everything. I got to walk during graduation anyway. Leroy was very gracious. But that diploma is still not on my wall in my office, not until I finish this today. So as soon as I get finished, it's on the way. So, any more questions as we conclude? I want that piece of paper. All right, so here's the focus of a thesis project. We need to isolate on a problem in ministry. Now, there are lots of problems in ministry, mostly people, but there are problems, and we need to focus on one that is of particular interest to whoever the researcher is. And for me, a significant part of my ministry has been funerals. Most of them for the unchurched. I've done probably 1,200 services now, mostly for the unchurched. And as I have been watching the landscape of the funeral industry evolve and change over the decades, there are a couple of concerns, especially for pastors, that need to be addressed. I'm hearing more and more from funeral directors, they no longer want to work with pastors because pastors don't understand the culture, they don't understand what the community is looking for. They don't understand grief, bereavement, ritual, these things I'm going to talk about here in just a few moments today. So I'm going to show you how I defined that particular problem in ministry, and then developed a hypothesis to solve the problem in ministry. I think this is how this problem can be solved. And then I need to develop a research question to find the solution to the problem. And wrapped up in that is going to be this hypothesis that I have developed. What might be a solution to this problem? Sometimes in research, I got a buddy who's here on Zoom today, as you're doing the research, you find out that the answer that you discovered is something that really doesn't work. And that's a legitimate research project because as Dwight Eisenhower said, we haven't failed, we've just discovered another way that doesn't work. And so it just depends on what your perspective is. So here's the problem in ministry as I define it relating to funeral ministry or bereavement leadership. A pastor who does not understand how personalized death rituals aid the bereaved in processing grief is ill-equipped to effectively practice contemporary funeral leadership methodologies. That's a mouthful. Back up, just walk it through a little bit more slowly. A pastor who does not understand how personalized death rituals, and a death ritual is anything you do to try to cope with your pain. any kind of a behavior that you do to try to cope with your loss and manage your loss. A pastor who doesn't understand how personalized death rituals aid the bereaved in processing grief. That's what rituals do. They help us process grief. Is ill-equipped to effectively practice, and here's the key, contemporary funeral leadership methodologies. We're going to show you a comparison between traditional and contemporary in just a few moments. So here's my hypothesis. Here's what I think is the solution to the problem. A pastor will be better equipped to effectively practice contemporary funeral leadership methodologies when he understands how personalized death rituals aid the bereaved in processing grief. Now, if you look carefully, it's just kind of like playing Scrabble. Every one of these words is like a tile, and you just rearrange them. So the hypothesis is very similar to the problem in ministry. I've just shuffled a lot of these words in different places to keep it tight and with a narrow focus on what we're doing here. So here's my research question. This is a question I sought to answer in the last year and a half, 2 years. Will a pastor who has been trained to understand how personalized death rituals aid the bereaved in processing grief demonstrate an increased commitment to practicing contemporary funeral leadership methodologies? Okay, that's a long sentence, but we've looked at it from several different angles. And is anybody still in the clouds, not sure exactly what we're looking at here with this question? We got it? We're there? Okay, that's the question I sought to answer. It's a long question, and there's a long answer. But we're going to give you the cliff notes, so to speak, on this today. So I mentioned a moment ago, traditional funerals and contemporary events. Here's what a traditional funeral is all about. Traditional funerals include, this is key, especially here in the Northwest. And that was my focus, Pacific Northwest. Bereavement leadership here in the Northwest. Traditional funerals include shared religious beliefs and church-like components such as hymn singing, scripture reading, prayer, and preaching. For most people in the Pacific Northwest, none of this is a part of their lifestyle. None of this is a part of their value system. Pastors who do funerals need to understand that, not only for the people in their own congregation at a traditional Christian service, because you're going to have people who don't resonate with this in your building. But if you're called on by a funeral home in the area to provide a service for somebody who is unchurched, you need to understand this, that your world is different than theirs, completely different. And you're entering their world and you're serving them where they are. That's effective leadership. We'll show you how that's done. Contemporary events, and it can be a number of things, not just a funeral service or a graveside or ashes scattering or whatever it might be, celebration of life. They are highly customized celebrations of, and I'm going to put in quotation marks, a life well lived, because that's what people want to think about. They want to look back over the life of the deceased and answer the question, what made this person's contributions to my world, to our world, better, unique? What was it about this person's life that was well done? We want to focus on that. We want to celebrate that. Okay. Here's an interesting comparison. I think it's interesting. Act interested if you don't think it's interesting anyway. Service trends in the U.S. and the Pacific Northwest. Traditional funerals are liturgical, which means a pastor will often, and they often do, will go from their bookshelf and pick up like the minister's star manual, open it up to a funeral, and begin reading the book and insert the name where there's a blank. That's liturgical. It's prescribed. It's pre-written, so to speak. That's tradition. Contemporary events are customized. I've done 1,200 services. I think no two have ever been the same because no two people are the same. And I really think that final event should really reflect the unique characteristics of that individual. Traditional funerals are casketed, which means there's a body in a box. It's present at the service and will be laid to rest after the event. You're not going to find many caskets here at Return Home. More about that later, perhaps. Contemporary events typically are earned, U-R-N-E-D, not E-A-R-N-E-D, earned, where there's been a cremation or some sort of accelerated body reduction, where the body is reduced to ashes, or in this case here at Return Home, compost, and placed in an urn or scattered in a garden or in a forest or at sea or whatever it might be. That is the trend. The cremation rate in the US is about 56%. Cremation rate in the Northwest, 80%. 8 out of 10. Traditional funerals are held in religiously aligned venues like a church building, a sanctuary, or a chapel at a funeral home. Funeral homes used to call their meeting rooms chapels. So there's one place where I do services occasionally. They took down the cross and put up a big screen. That reflects the culture. And they have to be contemporary. They have to remain current with culture to stay in business. So contemporary events are held in religiously neutral venues, a golf course, the beach, your backyard, here, wherever it can be, restaurants, people meet in different venues. No longer is it going to be necessarily in a church building or at a chapel at a funeral home. Traditional funerals are led by male clergy leadership, and the trend now for contemporary events is female non-clergy leadership. That is the huge trend in that direction. And then traditional funerals are forward focused with an eternal focus. In a traditional funeral, we talk not only about the person's life, but also the life to come. And that's where the preaching comes in and the scriptures. We want people to know that this is not the end. It's the beginning of something that never ends. Now, for contemporary events, let's say people are irreligious. They don't believe in eternal life. They don't believe there's anything beyond death. There's nothing to talk about in the future. Maybe personally your life as you work through your loss, but for the individual who died, the only way we can look is back. That's why it's a celebration of life, the past life. And the focus is on everything this person did. And there's not so much to talk about over here. So in my training, and Rusty was a part of this recently, I showed how you can take a secular service and earn the right to bring in spiritual truth that the family will let you. And I found out that usually the family will allow that to occur. There's some skills and some tips that need to be understood. That's for a different time and a different place, but it can happen. All right, let's just pause. That's the end of the first segment. I want to answer questions you might have and see if I can't bring some clarity to where we've been at this point. Anybody in the room? Let's start with people in the room. Any questions to begin with here inside this room? Micah.
You said you've done 1,200 services, many of them for the unchurched.
Yes.
Did you find in the beginning that you were relying on the liturgy, that you were actually using the tradition that you'd been trained in? And if so, what was the response? How did you feel about it? And how did you change over time?
Excellent question. Okay, so for those on Zoom, I don't know if you're able to hear Micah, but here's his question. He said, I've done 1,200 services, and at the beginning, when I started doing the services, did I default, and I'm paraphrasing here, to a liturgical methodology for doing the services? And if so, how was that received? And the answer, Micah, is no, because nobody taught me how to do funerals. I didn't know what a liturgical funeral was about. I went out and I bought every book I could on how to do funerals, and they were filled with poems and sermons. And so, I don't have it here up in front. So that's why I wrote my book, Leading Today's Funerals. So I talked to other pastors, I talked to some funeral home directors, and I said, coach me. How do I do this? Teach me how to do this. So I would sit down with the family and get to know them, and together we would co-create what a service would look like. Now back then, there was quite in our culture back then, in the early 80s, mid 80s and late 80s, still quite acceptable to have hymns, Bible reading and sermons and things, but the culture has shifted so much in the last 20 or 30 years, 40 years, that is not so much a part of our culture anymore. So I have made some adjustments. I still want to bring those components in if I can. I want it to be relevant, but the family makes the final decision about what that service looks like. And that's always been the way that I do that. So good question, Micah. Joshua.
Just wanted to state for the people on Zoom.
Yes.
They can, you can hear them, but they can also type in the chat if they want to ask a question that way.
Okay, good. So those who are on Zoom, if you have a question as I'm teaching, talking, or later on, you can always type it in the chat box, and Joshua back there will pick it up on the chat box. Good. So anybody else in the room here, anybody else on Zoom, have any questions at this point about what we covered in the first segment? Doing okay? Anybody here need to get another cup of coffee or some more orange juice or anything? Okay. All right, let's move on. Let's go to segment 2.